Welcome to The Explainer. In any trial, you're faced with an absolute avalanche of information. So how on earth does a court figure out what's a crucial fact and what's just, well, noise? Today, we are diving deep into the very first filter that every single piece of evidence has to pass. It's called relevance, and trust me, it is the ultimate gatekeeper.
Right. So every case kicks off with this potential flood of information, right? You've got stories, details, theories, a complete downpour. The court's number one job is to filter that avalanche and zero in on what actually matters. And the tool they use, the very first test, is relevance. It all begins right here. This is what you could call the first and most absolute rule in the entire law of evidence. It really is the first gatekeeper.
And here it is. This is the bedrock principle, and it is totally absolute. There are zero exceptions to this rule. If a piece of evidence isn't relevant to what's being argued in the case, it simply cannot be admitted. That's it. Its journey into the courtroom stops right here, dead in its tracks.
Okay, so let's look at the wording from the Evidence Act, because it's so key. Notice it doesn't say the evidence has to prove a fact. The bar is way lower than that. The only question is whether it could rationally affect the probability. Could it make a key fact just a little bit more likely, or a little bit less likely? If the answer is yes, boom, it passes the test.
So how does a judge actually apply this? I know it can feel a little abstract, but thankfully there's a really neat logical tool that helps break it all down. It's called a syllogism, which sounds complicated, but it's really just a simple three-step logic chain. First, you start with a general truth about how the world works. That's your major premise. Then, you bring in the specific piece of evidence from your case. That's the minor premise. And finally, you ask, does connecting those first two things make a key fact in the case seem more or less probable? Now, that first step, the major premise, is everything. It's the linchpin. If that general statement about the world isn't a solid, common-sense idea, the whole logical chain just completely falls apart.
And here is a perfect example of what I mean. Let's say you want to introduce evidence that the accused actually planned a murder. You can't build your argument on the premise that people who plan a murder always carry it out. I mean, that's just not provable, right? But the correct premise is much simpler and more logical. People who plan to kill someone are just more likely to do it than people who don't. And that tiny little shift in probability, that's all it takes for relevance. This brings us to probably the single biggest point of confusion for anyone studying evidence law. And that's the crucial difference between relevance and weight. I promise you, they are not the same thing. Think of it this way. You have two different jobs for two different groups of people. The judge handles relevance. Their question is all about potential. Could this evidence matter? It's a simple yes or no on getting in the door. If the judge says yes, it's passed on to the jury, and they decide the weight. They ask, how much does this evidence matter? Is it convincing? Is it powerful? Former Chief Justice Gleeson put this perfectly. He basically said that you can't get evidence thrown out just by arguing that it's weak. As long as it has some logical connection, even a tiny, slight one, it gets past the relevance test. How strong or weak it is, well, that's a question for the jury to worry about later on. Okay, so a piece of evidence gets past the relevance test. It's in, right? Game on? Well, not so fast. Relevance is just the first gatekeeper. Seriously, think of the law of evidence like a building with multiple layers of security. Relevance gets you in the front door, but inside there are a whole bunch of other guards and checkpoints that can still stop that evidence from ever reaching the jury. And those other checkpoints are some heavy hitters. We're talking about major exclusionary rules, like the ones you see here. They can block even the most relevant evidence you can imagine. A confession might seem super relevant, but if it was forced, it's out. An eyewitness account seems crucial, but if it's just repeating what someone else said, that's hearsay, and it's out. Each of these rules is there to protect the fairness of the trial, acting as another filter. So now we get to one of the most fascinating and kind of tricky scenarios in evidence law. What happens when a single piece of evidence is allowed for one reason, but is strictly forbidden for another? This example with the shirts breaks it down perfectly. Okay, let's say a guy is on trial for stealing shirt B. The prosecution has evidence that he also stole shirt C on a completely different day. Now, if the prosecutor tries to argue, hey, this guy's a thief, he steals things, so he probably stole shirt B too, that is completely forbidden. It's inadmissible character evidence. But what if the person who stole shirt B accidentally left shirt C at the crime scene? Now, all of a sudden, that exact same evidence, the fact he stole shirt C, is admissible. Why? Because its purpose has changed. It's not about his character anymore. It's about proving he was at the scene of the crime. Same fact, but the reasoning makes all the difference.
And there's a great term for this, pointed out by Justice Ormiston: multiple relevance and limited admissibility. The evidence is relevant in more than one way, but the court has to limit its use to only the one that's legally allowed.
So this puts the judge in a really tough spot. They have to give the jury this very specific, very careful instruction. It's like a form of mental gymnastics. They'll say something like, okay, members of the jury, you can use the evidence about shirt C only to help you decide if the accused was at the scene. You are absolutely forbidden from using it to think, oh, he's just the kind of person who steals.
And this leaves us with a really deep question, one that sits right at the heart of our entire justice system. We build our system on the idea that juries can and will follow these incredibly complex mental instructions. But can they? Can a person really hear a piece of damning evidence and then just ignore its most obvious meaning, all because a judge told them to? It's a huge question about human psychology and what we expect from people in the name of justice. And it's something we'll leave with you to think about. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.